30 seconds.
I yield back the remaining 30 seconds.
Without objection.
Without objection. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the nomination of Cornelia T.L. Pillard of the District of Columbia to be United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia Circuit, signed by 17 senators.
By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the nomination of Cornelia T.L. Pillard of the District of Columbia to be United States Circuit Judge for the District of Columbia Circuit shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander, Ms. Ayotte, Ms. Baldwin, Mr. Barrasso, Mr. Baucus, Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn. Mr. Crapo. Mr. Cruz. Mr. Donnelly. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Enzi. Mrs. Feinstein. Mrs. Fisher. Mr. Flake. Mr. Franken. Mrs. Gillibrand. Mr. Graham. Mr. Grassley. Mrs. Hagan. Mr. Harkin. Mr. Hatch. Mr. Heinrich. Ms. Heitkamp. Mr. Heller. Ms. Hirono. Mr. Hoven. Mr. Inhofe. Mr. Isaacson. Mr. Johans. Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin. Mr. Johnson of South Dakota. Mr. Kane. Mr. King. Mr. Kirk. Ms. Klobuchar. Ms. Landrieu. Mr. Leahy. Mr. Lee. Mr. Levin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Manchin. Mr. Markey. Mr. Markey. Mr. McCain. Mrs. McCaskill. Mr. McConnell.
No.
Mr. Menendez. Mr. Merkley. Ms. Mikulski. Mr. Moran. Ms. Murkowski. Mr. Murphy. Mrs. Murray. Mr. Paul. Mr. Portman. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Reed, Rhode Island. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Risch. Mr. Roberts. Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rubio. Mr. Sanders. Mr. Schatz. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Scott. Mr. Sessions. Mrs. Shaheen. Mr. Shelby. Mrs. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Ms. Stabenow. Mr. Tester. Mr. Thune. Mr. Toomey. Mr. Udall, Colorado. Mr. Udall of New Mexico. Mr. Vitter. Mr. Warner. Ms. Warren. Mr. Whitehouse. Mr. Wicker. Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Baldwin, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Booker, Boxer, Brown, Cantwell, Cardin, Carper, Coons, Feinstein, Franken, Gillibrand, Hagan, Heitkamp, Hirono, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Manchin, Markey, McCaskill, Pryor, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, Sanders, Schatz, Shaheen, Tester, Udall of New Mexico, Warner, Warren, Wyden.
Aye. We cancel each other out.
Ms. Stabenow? Aye. Mr. Coates? Aye. Mr. Merkley? Aye. Ms. Collins? Aye. Mr. Udall of Colorado? Aye. Mr. Menendez? Aye.
No, this is a district. Okay, sure. November.
He's a handsome
Senators voting in the negative: Alexander, Ayotte, Barrasso, Blunt, Bozeman, Burr, Chambliss, Coburn, Cochran, Cornyn, Crapo, Cruz, Enzi, Fisher, Flake, Graham, Grassley, Heller, Hoven, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Lee, McConnell, Moran, Hall, Roberts, Rubio, Scott, Shelby, Thune, Toomey, Vitter, Wicker. Mr. Coates, no. Mr. Corker, no. Mr. Casey, aye. Mr. Risch, no. Ms. Murkowski, aye. Mr. Murphy, aye. Mr. McCain, no. Mr. Portman, no. Mr. Kirk, no. Mr. Nelson, aye. Mr. Sessions, no. Mr. Levin, aye. Mr. Whitehouse, aye. Ms. Mikulski, aye. Mr. Harkin, aye. Mr. Donnelly, aye. Mr. Heinrich. Mr. Heinrich, aye. Mrs. Murray. Mrs. Murray, aye. Mr. Durbin. Mr. Durbin, aye. Mr. Bennett. Mr. Bennett, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Schumer. Mr. Schumer, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada. Mr. Reed of Nevada, no.
Any senators wishing to change votes? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 56, the nays are 41. One senator responded present. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn not having voted in the affirmative. The motion is not agreed to.
Madam President. Madam President.
Majority Leader.
I enter a motion to reconsider the vote by which cloture was not invoked on the pillared nomination.
The motion is entered. Under the previous order, under the previous order, the Senate will resume legislative session. The clerk will report the motion to invoke cloture.
Cloture motion. We, the undersigned senators, in accordance with the provisions of Rule 22 of the Standing Rules of the Senate, hereby move to bring to a close the debate on the motion to proceed to calendar number 236, H.R. 3204, an act to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to human drug compounding and drug supply chain security and for other purposes, signed by 17 senators.
Senate will be in order. Senate will be in order. By unanimous consent, the mandatory quorum call has been waived. The question is it the sense of the Senate that debate on the motion to proceed to H.R. 3204, an act to amend the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act with respect to human drug compounding and drug supply chain security and for other purposes, shall be brought to a close? The yeas and nays are mandatory under the rule. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander. Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin. Mr. Barrasso. Mr. Baucus. Mr. Begich. Mr. Begich, Mr. Bennett, Mr. Blumenthal. Mr. Blumenthal, Mr. Blunt, Mr. Booker, Mr. Bozeman, Mrs. Boxer, Mr. Brown, Mr. Burr, Ms. Cantwell, Mr. Cardin, Mr. Carper, Mr. Casey, Mr. Chambliss, Mr. Coates, Mr. Coburn, Mr. Cochran, Ms. Collins, Mr. Coons, Mr. Corker, Mr. Cornyn, Mr. Crapo, Mr. Cruz, Mr. Donnelly, Mr. Durbin, Mr. Enzi, Mrs. Feinstein, Mrs. Fisher, Mr. Flake, Mr. Franken, Mrs. Gillibrand, Mr. Graham, Mr. Grassley, Mrs. Hagan, Mr. Harkin, Mr. Hatch, Mr. Heinrich, Ms. Heitkamp, Mr. Heller, Ms. Hirono, Mr. Hoven, Mr. Inhofe, Mr. Isaacson, Mr. Johans, Mr. Johnson of Wisconsin, Mr. Johnson of South Dakota, Mr. Kane, Mr. King, Mr. Kirk, Ms. Klobuchar, Ms. Landrieu, Mr. Leahy, Mr. Lee, Mr. Levin, Mr. Manchin, Mr. Markey, Mr. McCain, Mrs. McCaskill, Mr. McConnell, Mr. Menendez, Mr. Merkley, Ms. Mikulski, Mr. Moran, Ms. Murkowski, Mr. Murphy, Mrs. Murray, Mr. Nelson, Mr. Paul, Mr. Portman, Mr. Pryor, Mr. Reed of Rhode Island, Mr. Reed of Nevada, Mr. Risch, Mr. Roberts, Mr. Rockefeller, Mr. Rubio, Mr. Sanders, Mr. Schatz, Mr. Schumer, Mr. Scott, Mr. Sessions, Mrs. Shaheen, Mr. Shelby, Ms. Stabenow, Mr. Tester, Mr. Thune, Mr. Toomey, Mr. Udall of Colorado, Mr. Udall of New Mexico, Mr. Vitter, Mr. Warner, Ms. Warren, Mr. Whitehouse, Mr. Wicker, Mr. Wyden. Senators voting in the affirmative: Alexander, Ayotte, Baldwin, Barrasso, Baucus, Begich, Bennett, Blumenthal, Blunt, Bozeman, Boxer, Brown, Burr, Cantwell, Cardin, Casey, Chambliss, Coates, Coburn, Collins, Coons, Corker, Cornyn, Cruz, Donnelly, Durbin, Enzi, Feinstein, Fisher, Flake, Franken, Gillibrand, Graham, Grassley, Hagan, Harkin, Hatch, Heinrich, Heitkamp, Heller, Hirono, Hoven, Isaacson, Johnson of Wisconsin, Johnson of South Dakota, Kane, King, Kirk, Klobuchar, Landrieu, Leahy, Lee, Levin, Manchin, Markey, McCain, McCaskill, McConnell, Menendez, Merkley, Mikulski, Moran, Murkowski, Murphy, Murray, Nelson, Paul, Portman, Reed of Rhode Island, Rockefeller, Rubio, Sanders, Schatz, Schumer, Scott, Sessions, Shaheen, Shelby, Tester, Thune, Toomey, Udall of Colorado, Warner, Whitehouse, Wicker, and Wyden. Mr. Booker, aye. Mr. Reed of Nevada, aye. Mr. Roberts, aye. Mr. Udall of New Mexico, aye. Mr. Cochran, aye. Senators voting in the negative, Vitter. Mr. Crapo, aye. Mr. Risch, aye. Ms. Stabenow, aye. Ms. Warren, aye. Mr. Carper. Mr. Carper, aye. Mr. Pryor. Mr. Pryor, aye.
Any senator wishing to change a vote? If not, on this vote, the yeas are 97, the nays are 1. 3/5 of the senators duly chosen and sworn having voted in the affirmative, the motion is agreed to. The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Alexander.
Ms. Ayotte. Ms. Baldwin.
Sure, a while ago, the Senate voted to move forward with debate on a bill that would expand the Food and Drug Administration's oversight of compounding pharmacies. However, earlier, Senate Republicans blocked the nomination of Nina Pollard to the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. The vote there was 56 to 41. It fell shy of the 60 votes needed to invoke cloture and move forward with that nomination. Much earlier today, Iowa Senator Chuck Grassley talked about his opposition to the Pollard nomination.
To the floor to speak in opposition to the motion to invoke cloture on the nomination for the D.C. Circuit nominee Cornelia T.L. Although her record makes clear her views are well outside the mainstream on a host of issues, I'm not going to focus any attention on those concerns today. I'm going to focus instead on the standard the Democrats established in the year 2006. Based on that standard, the court's caseload makes clear that the workload simply doesn't justify additional judges, particularly when those additional judges cost approximately $1 million per year per judge. Now, I've walked through these statistics several times now, and I'm not going to go in depth again. The bottom line is this. The data overwhelmingly supports the conclusion that the D.C. Circuit is underworked. Everyone knows this is true. That circuit does not need any more judges. Now, take, for instance, the appeals filed and appeals terminated. In both categories, the D.C. Circuit ranks last. And in both categories, the D.C. Circuit is less than half the national average. To provide some perspective on this point, compare the D.C. Circuit to the 11th. After another judge took senior status about a week ago, both the D.C. Circuit and the 11th Circuit have 8 active judges. If we don't confirm any more judges to either court, the numbers remain the same as last year. The 11th Circuit will have 875 appeals per active judge compared to the 149 appeals filed per active judge in D.C., which also has 8 active judges. Again, that's 875 cases for the 11th compared to 149 for D.C. Now, some might argue that we shouldn't look only at active judges because those averages will change if and when we confirm more judges to the 11th Circuit. Suppose we fill each judgeship on the 11th Circuit and each judgeship on the D.C. Circuit as the Democrats want to do. If we fill them all, there would be 583 appeals filed per judge for the 11th Circuit and only 108 for the D.C. Circuit. The 11th Circuit then has over 5 times the caseload. This is why everyone who has looked at this objectively understands the caseload for the D.C. Circuit is stunningly low. That is why current judges on the court have written to me and said things like this, and I want to quote from one of the letters, quote, "If any more judges were added now, there wouldn't be enough work to go around," end of quote. Now, some of my friends on the other side recognize that the D.C. Circuit's caseload is low, and they claim then that the caseload numbers don't take into account the quote-unquote complexity of the court's docket. They argue that the D.C. Circuit hears more administrative appeals than other circuits do, and they claim these administrative appeals are more complex. This argument is nonsense, and I want to tell you why it's nonsense. I've heard my colleagues argue repeatedly that the D.C. Circuit's docket is complex because 43% of the docket is made up of administrative appeals. But of course, that is a high percentage of a very small number. When you look at the actual number of those so-called complex cases per judge, well, the Second Circuit has almost twice as many as the D.C. Circuit. In 2012, there were 512 administrative appeals filed in D.C. In the Second Circuit, there were 1,493 compared to that 512. Now, we can look at this differently as well. There were only, in D.C., there were only 64 administrative appeals per active judge. The Second Circuit has nearly twice as many per judge with 115. Again, that's 64 administrative appeals per active judge, D.C. Circuit, as opposed to the Second Circuit, which has almost twice as many with 115. So, this entire argument about complexity is what I already called it, nonsense, and the other side knows it, and if they don't know it, they ought to know it. Now let me raise another question regarding caseload. If these cases were really that hard, if these cases were really so complex, then why in the world would the D.C. Circuit take the entire summer off? And I'm not talking about just a couple weeks in August. They don't hear any cases for the entire summer. The D.C. Circuit has so few cases on their docket that they don't hear any cases from the middle of May until the second week of September. This past term, the last case they heard before taking the summer off was May 16th. The court didn't hear another case until September the 9th, 4 months later. The bottom line is this. Everyone knows this court doesn't have enough cases as it is, let alone if we would add more judges. That is why when you ask the current judges for their candid assessment, they write, and I say this again, quote, if any more judges were confirmed now, there wouldn't be enough work to go around, end of quote. Now, while I'm discussing the caseload issue, I want to remind my colleagues of just a little bit of history, but very pertinent for this debate that's going on here. In 2006, the Democrats on the Judiciary Committee blocked Peter Keisler's nomination to the D.C. Circuit. They blocked Mr. Keisler's nomination based upon, would you guess it, the court's caseload. Since that time, by the standard set by the other side, the court's caseload has declined sharply. We didn't set this standard. The Democrats set that standard. I recognize that the other side wants to rewrite history. They tried to compare John Roberts' second nomination to the circuit, which passed fairly easily, with the current nomination. What they conveniently forget in a misleading way is that they blocked Keisler's nomination after Roberts' nomination. I recognize that the other side hopes that we on this side will forget that they established these rules and these precedents. I recognize that the other side finds those rules very, very inconvenient today. But these are not reasons to ignore rules and precedents that they establish. There is simply no legitimate reason that the other side should not embrace those very same rules, those very same standards that they established in the year 2006. So under that standard established by the Democrats in 2006, then very simply, these nominations are not needed. According to the current judges themselves, these judges are not needed. According to the chief judge of the D.C. Circuit, who happens to be a Clinton appointee, the senior judges are contributing the equivalent of an additional 3 1/4 judges. So, as a result, the court already has the equivalent of 11 1/4 judges, and that's way beyond, or that is beyond even the authorized number. So, it seems pretty clear that the other side has run out of legitimate arguments in support of these nominations. Perhaps that is why then they're resorting to such cheap tactics. Over the last couple of days, I've heard my colleagues on the other side actually come to the floor and actually argue that Republicans are opposing the nominee because of her gender. That argument is offensive, but you know, it tends to be very predictable. We've seen this before. When the other side runs out of legitimate arguments, their last line of defense is to accuse Republicans of opposing nominees based upon gender or race. It's an old and it's a well-worn card, and they play it every time. The fact of the matter is, and this is why it's offensive to me, is that I voted for 75 women nominated to the bench by President Obama, as well as a host of other nominees of diverse backgrounds. Those are the facts, but the other side isn't concerned with facts. They're more interested in coarse rhetoric as well as demagoguery. And it's very unfortunate. Those types of personal attacks on members of the Senate are beneath this institution. Now, given that there is no legitimate reason to fill these seats, why is the other side pushing these nominations so aggressively? And this is really the bottom line. But you can also ask, why waste $3 million a year of taxpayers' money for reasons that are not legitimate, particularly in violation of the constitutional checks and balances? Now, as to these other reasons, we don't have to guess. We know the reason. We've all heard the President pledge repeatedly, if Congress won't act, I will. What he means, of course, is that he will rule by executive fiat. He won't go to Congress. He won't negotiate. He'll go around this constitutionally elected body whose constitutional powers is to make law. That's not his power. He doesn't need legislators then to enact legislation. He'll just issue executive orders or issue new agency rules. Why bother with us pesky senators and members of the House when you can make laws with a stroke of the pen? In effect, the President is saying, if the Senate won't confirm who I want, when I want them, then I'll recess appoint them when the Senate isn't even when the Senate is even in session. If Congress won't pass cap and trade fee increases, then I'll go around them. And I'll do the same thing through administrative action at the Environmental Protection Agency. If Congress won't pass gun control legislation, then I'll issue executive orders. That is what the President means when he says, if Congress won't act, I will. But remember, we have a system of checks and balances. Under our system, when the President issues orders by executive fiat, it's the courts that provide a check on his power. It's the courts that decide whether the President is acting unconstitutionally. So the only way the President's plan works is if he stacks the deck in his favor. The only way the President can successfully bypass Congress is if he stacks the court with ideological allies who will rubber stamp those executive orders. There is no big secret here. The other side hasn't been shy about this strategy. Here is how the Washington Post described this strategy. Quote, given liberals a greater say on the D.C. Circuit is important for Obama as he looks for ways to circumvent the Republican-led House and a polarized Senate on a number of policy fronts through executive order and other administrative procedures, end of quote. End of quote. Here's another high-profile administration ally put it, quote, there are a few things more vital on the President's second-term agenda. With legislative priorities gridlocked in the Congress, the President's best hope for advancing his agenda is through executive action, and that runs through the D.C. Circuit. So the President is willing to waste $3 million of taxpayers' money a year and every year in order to bypass Congress and make sure his executive orders don't lose in court. Every member of this body should find that very, very troubling. Finally, I want to mention a couple of points on the so-called Gang of 14 agreement, which argument comes up quite frequently here on the floor, even though it's going back to the 109th Congress. First, by the very terms of that agreement, it applied only to those 14 senators for that specific Congress, the 109th. Second, even though that agreement by its own terms expired at the end of the 109th Congress,